Welcome to the Religious Treehouse. I'm Matthew.
And I'm Jody.
How are you doing today, Jody?
I am doing fabulous. How are you today, Matthew?
Just as fabulous as ever. I am excited for our conversation today. Today we're starting a series. So if you've been following along, you the listener know that we've been kind of going back and forth doing a movie review or review of pop culture or something, and then going back into something about religion, Hebrew Bible, religious studies, something like that. So we're going to be starting a series now where we're going to be going through Phyllis Trible's book, The Text of Terror. It's like 4 chapters long, fairly short, but it's like one of my favorite books in biblical studies. So we'll be going through a chapter of that every other week for the next 8 weeks technically. And I'm excited for this. It's from like the 80s, so it's a little bit outdated, but it holds up, I think, in a lot of ways. There's a lot of ways it feels very 80s in biblical scholarship, but I'm very excited to talk about the literary feminist readings of biblical narrative as promoted by Phyllis Trible. This should be fun, and I'm very much looking forward to it.
We're talking about women. That makes me happy. I got to be
Yeah,
honest.
and we're getting Jody to read introductions and then also the rest of the book because Jody doesn't believe in reading introductions.
Why are you introducing a book when I could just read it?
Right, you're wrong, but
I
okay.
don't think so. Like, you go through the introduction, what I'm going to go through in the book.
Yeah, but you need to be prepared for the book. You need to know you need to know the methodologies that are being used in the book. You need to know the perspective that it's coming from. You can't just jump into it.
But you'll know what methodologies are being used in while reading the book. You'll know. You'll pick it up.
Whatever. This is something that we always disagree with, but you should, if you're interested in following along with us, there might be like an illegal PDF on the internet somewhere that you can find, or just buy the book. It's a great book. It's a small book, but it's a great book. But yeah, shall we get started?
Yes, we shall. Where shall we
Cool.
start? Chapter one?
No, we should start in the introduction. um, but no, in the introduction, Phyllis Tribble, kind of, and this is we should start with my introduction. This is
Oh,
like one of the books that I've read 2 or 3 times before this because it's just so good, and there's a lot to go through it and analyze. So I'm sure there'll be times where I talk about how the first time I read this differed from the time I'm reading this now, and how all that happens. But a fantastic book that is very 80s, but also still holds up. And by very 80s, I mean like the big thing in biblical scholarship there was like connecting everything to the Exodus. Like everything is connected to the Exodus story in some way or another. And I think that holds up in a lot of places, but like they were gung ho about it. They're full in. Everything's connected to the Exodus. Right now, recently, everything is related to trauma theory and how that's related through the Hebrew Bible and as an extension of the Exodus. But kind of when this was written, the big thing in biblical studies was connecting things to the Exodus, and we get that a lot in this chapter, in chapter one as well. So that's what I mean by it's dated. I think a lot of the scholarship still holds up very, very well, and that's what we'll be talking about.
it'd be interesting to talk about biblical study fads through the decades, like
Yeah,
the different focuses. But this one is the Exodus because I noticed that there's a
yeah,
lot of the word Exodus just throughout at just chapter one because that's what I've read up to.
right. Um, but yeah, so in her introduction, she starts with talking about I think this is a good thing that we should talk about before we get into this because we're talking about the Old Testament. And we've talked about this a little, but when it comes to the Old Testament, a lot of people, Christians particularly, tend to think of this Old Testament God of wrath and anger and hate and stuff like that. And we look at the New Testament God of love and compassion and all that stuff. We talked about that, and that's wrong. There's plenty of divine wrath, divine love in both testaments of the Christian Bible. And there's a tension between the love and wrath of God in both. And it's not exclusive to one or the other. And that's something that we have to understand when reading this. But at the same time, when we're reading these Old Testament narratives, it's important to read them in their own context, in their own literary context, which is what's happening here. There's a tendency in Christianity to try to look at suffering characters in the Old Testament and say they're a precursor to Jesus's suffering in some way or another. And I think that lessens the narrative of the story. It lessens the trauma that these characters, especially women, are facing in these narratives that Trible's presenting us. So I don't think it's helpful to try to look at this from a particularly New Testament lens and impose that onto the Old Testament. So we're going to be looking at this from its literary context as it's presented to us in its final form. Uh, so that's the other thing. A lot of times when we talk about Exodus and stuff like that, I like to bring in source criticism and things like that because I think that's a fun thing. But with the literary criticism that Phyllis Trible is presenting, it's much more looking at the final form of how this is presented to us, looking at the form and the content and the meaning and how the sentences relate to each other and the syntax, and how the episodes and scenes and overall plot interact together, regardless of how the sources compiled them. So I think it's important to realize that the methodologies that we're using that aren't always named. Like anytime that we're talking about biblical studies in some way, we have this methodology, this lens that we're looking at through the text. And oftentimes I try to put on a historical critical lens. That's my favorite go-to method to talk about the biblical text. But what we're doing here is looking at a literary feminist reading of these texts. And oftentimes what was presented in churches and regular talking about this is there's no label defined behind that. And what people assume is because there's no label behind it, this is the regular go-to meaning. But what that usually means is that it's the straight white male European reading of the text. So by intentionally being aware of this literary feminist reading, I think there's a lot more that we can glean from these texts that other readings that might have been normalized have omitted, perhaps.
That was beautifully said. All I have to contribute is I look through the lens of a kaleidoscope, undefined.
What does that mean?
I don't know. I look at it all, I guess, because I'm like, these are real technical ways to look at this. And I'm like, how do we, I don't want to say dumb it down, but how to make it friendly to the everyday person.
Yeah. Yeah. And no, for sure. And what I appreciate about this text is that I think it bridges the gap between popular work and scholarship,
Mhm.
while it's a fairly academic piece that isn't necessarily meant for the everyday average person. I think it's still fairly readable for someone who doesn't have any formal training in religious studies or biblical studies or anything like that. Like, did you find it fairly readable?
I did. I did find it,
Mm,
but like I was also still like left with questions because it's
right.
like
Yeah.
what like yeah. So there's a lot of different ways I guess to look at the Bible.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we need to be aware that there's a lot of different ways to look at the Bible and not think that just because we're not intentionally looking at it through a specific lens doesn't mean we're not looking through it with a specific lens.
Yeah.
And even looking at it, even if I try to read it through this literary feminist lens, I'm still bringing in all of my own baggage, my own subconscious lenses to the whole topic as well.
Yeah.
There's no way to completely distinguish yourself from the text. As I read a text, the text reads me, and we can't separate ourselves from that. Um, and that's something I think a lot of people don't realize.
Well, let's get into it.
Let's get into it. So, chapter 1 of Text of Terror is about the story of Hagar. Do you want to give us a summary of what happens in these two sections?
Sarah couldn't give Abraham a child, so she said, "Take my handmaid, Hagar, and impregnate her." And so she did, and Sarah got mad, and Sarah hit her. That's my interpretation. And then Hagar was like, "I gotta get out of here." And then God, the deity spoke to Hagar and said, "Go back. I shall bless you. Their offspring shall multiply." And so she went back, and then Abraham got Sarah pregnant. And Abraham was promised that his offspring would multiply and that he should send Hagar away. And so then Hagar was in the desert. And then Hagar's staring at her baby, and she's like, my baby's going to die. And then the deity comes again and is like, no, care for the child, raise him up, and find him a wife. And so then Hagar becomes detached from her son and is merely a caregiver as he goes on this ultimate quest to become the Ishmael. And it's so sad.
Yeah, okay. That's a good overview for sure. But yeah, there's two narratives here, one in Genesis 16 and one in Genesis 21. And we have some middle story. And in that middle story is like the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, which we talked about, 2 weeks ago. So we're going to be real heavy with Genesis right now. That's cool. But yeah, so what we start with in Genesis 16 is we see that Sarah is kind of repeatedly shown this divine favor, despite being barren. So she plans to use her maid, her enslaved worker, Hagar, to get a child. Um, and I think it's important if we're looking at this if we're looking at Hagar to see what Hagar's experience to see what that means, we have to realize that this has been passed down through us through the lens of the oppressor. So we're reading this story through the authorship of the oppressor, where Hagar is the oppressed slave working here. Um, so we can't really get that perspective as well. We have to see through the mist to see what Hagar might actually really be experiencing. And that's the literary feminist aspect of this, to kind of read the details of the text, of the words being used to figure out all of that.
Well, yeah,
And we get two different stories. The first being bondage to flight back to bondage. And then the second story, we get bondage to expulsion to homelessness. And as I mentioned, if I want to go back to my source critical readings of this, I would say this is probably a doublet, meaning these are probably two separate stories that have been merged into the Genesis narrative. But that's not what Phyllis Trible here is doing, so we're not going to really get into that too much.
no, but that's good to address because I was like reading all of it. Like, I was like, I want to make sure I read the actual biblical stuff, like straight from the Bible and not just through this chapter. And then I was like, there's all this middle part. Where's Hagar? Where's Hagar in all this middle? And then I get to
Yeah,
21 and there she is.
yeah.
And she
No, she
disappeared.
disappears in the middle for sure, and then she comes back when it's useful to the narrative.
Yes. But
But
yes, Sarah's barren
Sarah's barren.
and she can't produce a baby.
Yeah, no, we're introduced to these two female characters. We have Sarai, because we have Sarai and Abram here, and it's not until the second story where they're renamed to be Sarah and Abraham as we know them. So Sarai is rich and married and free and holds the power, and Hagar is poor and single and enslaved, but she's also young and fertile. So she's without this power, but becomes this kind of object in order to get what Sarai wants, what Sarah and Abraham want. Um, so Sarai speaks of building herself up through getting a child through Hagar, and kind of plans to counter this divinely appointed barrenness through this maid who she never speaks to. She never says her name. And Hagar is seen as this tool and not a person for Sarai, which is a downer and not good.
Which is a downer is an understatement. It's wrecked, man. This is crazy. I will be built up upon another woman's womb is wild. It's
Mm.
giving Handmaid's Tale. And for those wondering, this is not the Handmaid's Tale story that they based it off of. That's another one later in Genesis. But this has a
Okay.
lot of similarities. Well, because do you know about the Handmaid's Tale, the TV show?
I mean, I've
Like,
heard of it. I've never read it. I know more about Margaret Atwood's book, *Handmaid's Tale*, which I assume the TV show is based off of.
yes.
But no, I've not read or watched either of them.
Okay, I've watched, and like the ceremony is wild because it's just the whole configuration with the wife and then the handmaid. And so I had that visual going into this. Um, were handmaids off the common in this time? Was that a
I
thing?
don't. None of my translations. I would never translate this as handmaid. I think just maid. She's a servant of
Yeah.
some sort. She's a slave. She's an enslaved worker. We oftentimes try to lessen that translation by saying servant or maid or something like that. But she's an enslaved worker.
Were surrogates a thing?
I mean, we're kind of seeing that here, aren't we?
Well, yes, but someone said it was like really common in like a Reddit comment section. They're like, surrogates were really common in this time. And I was like, I know it's in the Bible, but does that mean it's really common? If it's in the Bible, does that mean it's common?
I don't know of it as being common. I wouldn't think it would be common. But if it's on Reddit, there's a good chance it's wrong.
Exactly. People go on Reddit and speak with such authority. And I'm like, are you sure?
Yeah, I don't know. Like when people are on the internet, they feel like, oh, we don't need to cite our sources, especially if it's like on an anonymous platform like Reddit. Like, oh, we can just say whatever we want. No, cite your sources. Sometimes I get on Reddit for funsies, and I like type out a response, and then I have to like go back through and like, okay, here's my sources, which no one else does, and I think it really annoys people. But it's fine. I can't help myself.
We appreciate you doing the most. Sorry, I had to make the Handmaid's Tale connection because it's the show The Handmaid's Tale and the book is rooted so much in biblical like
Hmm,
study, like they draw from the Bible. And then I remember them making in the first few episodes some comparisons between the husbands and Abraham and the wives and Sarah. So
sure.
that was lingering in my head, but then, did my due diligence, and Genesis 30 is more of
Hmm.
an inspiration because they all live together harmoniously. That doesn't happen in this story.
Yeah, very, very rarely do people live harmoniously in the Bible. Um, and I can't think of anywhere in Genesis where I'd say they live harmoniously together.
Well, at least, there's not supposed to be any tension between the wife and the handmaid, which is what in the Handmaid's Tale, what they're trying to achieve. They're trying to achieve both of them fulfilling a role in order to repopulate.
Fascinating. Interesting.
And
Okay.
so they both have to be in agreement, which isn't what you see here as we
No.
go back to this, because Sarah does give Hagar to Abraham, but then when
Hmm.
Hagar's pregnant, she says that Hagar is looking down on her, which Hagar did.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, no. So it's interesting that Hagar is given to Abraham as his wife, not as a concubine per se. Which I would like to note here that when people talk about biblical marriage, they usually aren't referring to this for some reason. Biblical marriage, when Christians talk about that, doesn't usually mean taking multiple wives. Um, so just want to put that out there as a little factoid. But um,
And
Hagar
shouldn't we
becomes
cite one of the first sources of marriage?
yeah. Oh, Hagar becomes Abraham's wife. And in this, Sarai has kind of lessened herself to Hagar, while still maintaining some sort of control over Abram. But then when Hagar, conceives a child, she's still narrated passively, and this prompts even more tension between the two. By giving Hagar to Abraham as a wife, Sarai is hoped to be built up and all that stuff, but instead Hagar is built up, and Sarai feels threatened by that, and she is lowered in the eyes of Hagar. So, as one does, Sarai wants her superior status returned, demands Abraham rectifies this, but Abraham is still passive. So, in doing this, Hagar sees a new reality that challenges the power structure, and this vision kind of intensifies the system instead of frees her from it. There's this extra wrath. That's not the right word, but there's this intensification coming from Sarai, and it leads
Jealousy.
jealousy. Yeah, 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 for sure, and it leads Hagar to leave the the unit in her own kind of exodus, as Trible explains it.
Yeah. Well, because she gotta get out of Dodge, man. She's
Yeah,
pregnant with a child. And so this she didn't choose this man to have the child with. That doesn't
yeah,
lessen the fact that she loves the child within her.
sure.
During this time, children are a gift, right? Like,
Yeah, I mean they're seen as offspring that will continue your name generate. That's why it's so common for um, God to promise generations upon generations to people. But yeah, offspring are seen as good for the most part.
well, yeah, and again, this is me not being able to separate myself from the story, but I just feel like it makes sense for any woman, especially if she's been afflicted upon, to want to get out of that situation. That's not always the case for everyone, but she was like, this isn't good. I gotta skedaddle.
Right. No, she didn't choose to be married to Abram. She's being used and abused in that sense. Like, this is not her choice. She's not an active participant. Her personhood is in question throughout this entire story.
Yep.
Um, but yeah, so in her exile, she flees, making it almost to Egypt. And we should note Hagar is Egyptian. She's an
Yes.
Egyptian slave. I don't think we mentioned that yet.
No.
But she makes it nearly to Egypt, finding this hospitable spring. And just like Moses, she encounters this deity while fleeing from her oppressors. And this is notable because this is the first time a messenger visits a deity, or this is the first time a messenger visits a person. This is the first time a deity visits a person. Is this enslaved Egyptian woman, Hagar, which often will get glossed over, but this is important.
This is huge. This
Yeah,
is the first, like, this is our first deity sighting.
yeah,
Like, this is big, and it's not said in like it is a big thing, because it is a big thing. It's not highlighted. There's the word.
yeah.
Um,
Like,
which I love
like
that
you
for her.
get God walking among the garden with Adam and Eve, but this is the first time like a messenger is intentionally sent to a person,
And
and that person is that this is the first time in the story where a character speaks to Hagar directly and uses her name and acknowledges her personhood. Though she is given the title of maid of Sarai, so her personhood is still kind of in question. She's not Hagar; she's Hagar, maid of Sarai. Um, but the messenger asks Hagar a question: "What are you doing here? Where are you going? What's the buzz? Tell me what's happening." And Hagar finally speaks for the first time and answers where she's coming from. And this, full personhood still kind of eludes her, but she's trying to present herself as a person. And we see this in the grammar. She uses anoki, which is, I uh, translated, but by emphasizing anoki, she's trying to present herself as a person against how Sarah uses anoki. And we should note here in Hebrew grammar, it's kind of like Spanish where you have congregations, conjugations. This will come up in next week's episode, but when writing in Hebrew, you can talk about words. Let's talk about Spanish. Spanish, I think, is much more familiar to people. I could say "Yo quiero Taco Bell." I want Taco Bell.
yeah.
But also in Spanish, you could just say "Quiero Taco Bell."
Mm.
Adding the "yo" in "Yo quiero" kind of puts an emphasis on "I want it," even though it's more grammatic. It's just as grammatically correct to say "Quiero Taco Bell." And that kind of it works in the same way as Hebrew. You don't always need the pronoun I in order to talk about the sentence. You can just kind of have the verb there, similar to in Spanish. Um, so by emphasizing the anarchy, that I, we're kind of putting this emphasis on Hagar there, emphatically presenting her personhood.
This is the first time you've explained the translation and I've understood it. And it took Yo quiero Taco Bell.
Yo quiero
So
Taco Bell.
no, I finally clicked there. Okay, cool. So she's standing up for herself. So she's reaffirming to herself. Oh, that's what makes what happens at the end even sadder.
Yeah, no, it's a sad story.
Oh, this is because okay, her first attempt to escape, she still has her self-identity. She's she was doing it for herself, and then this deity comes in and says, "No, go back.
Mhm.
No, there will be many offspring, and they will
Yeah.
offshoot from you. Let me promise you this wondrous future."
Mhm.
Oh, this sucks.
Yeah, she never answers the question about where she's going. When the divine figure asks her where she's going, implying maybe that departure is all she's looking for. That the wilderness is this point of return, which taking out of Phyllis Trible's analysis, there are some interpreters that read like when Adam and Eve get expelled from the garden, they go into exile, and the exile from or the exile from Babylon captivity, that the natural state is the state of exile, and going back to the garden, going back to you know Abraham and Sarai is the unnatural state. So arguments can be made for that, and I think that's interesting. Not what Phyllis Tribble is talking about here, but it should be noted.
Well, also, how terrible is it with Sarai and Abram if she's like,
Mm.
I'd rather just face the woods. I would
Yeah.
truly just rather face the wilderness with no destination in mind. At least I am myself and I can see a future.
Hmm.
And yet she listens to the deity.
Yeah, the deity reminds her she demands Hagar to return to Sarai and Abram and suffer affliction, like the words use, like you go back and suffer under the affliction of Sarai.
What
Um,
gender is the deity? Does it say? Is there like a
I mean, it usually
translation?
uses masculine pronouns,
Okay.
um, but yeah, it's a messenger of some sort. I don't think it's explicit, but just generally masculine.
Okay.
Um,
So a man tells her to go back to an abusive situation. Okay.
yeah. um, but yeah, but at this time she's also kind of assured of immeasurable descendants, and she's the only woman to be given that promise. Often, when people are told to like, or by told by a deity, by God, that they're going to have tons of descendants, it's always a man. Hagar is the only woman told that she will have um, numerous descendants like that. It lacks the covenantal language that is paired with when men receive it, but it's still notable that she receives that. But at that time, she also receives the birth announcement, or the Annunciation. And Trible kind of outlines three general elements to Annunciation, being like the prediction of the birth of a male, specifically a male, the naming of the child, and then the future life of the child. And we got kind of get that here. This is the first time that it's seen here, and it kind of acts as this, you know, narrative, this type of how other enunciations work throughout the Bible. There's this is up for debate. Like other scholars see this differently, how they're numbered, what exactly constitutes the entirety of the type form of a birth announcement in the Bible. And I think like Robert Alter, he attributes the first Annunciation to Sarah and Abraham's Isaac. So like this is up for debate for sure, but I tend to follow Phyllis Trible's reasoning here that this is going to be the first Annunciation that works as the prototype for further Annunciations, and he names him Ishmael, God hears. So it signifies the comfort, but also suffering of God hears what Hagar is saying, but also because God hears, she's going to be suffering for it and has to go back to Sarai.
If God's hearing, then why can't she go? Why can't she leave? I'm sorry. I just think I'm like, if you're hearing how terrible these people you want to eventually bless and
Yeah,
give a nation to, why are you
right.
sending this poor woman back?
Yeah, and I think this is where we get the feminist reading of it, of her analysis, where this is written by a patriarchal society and written by the oppressors that see Abram and Sarai as the ultimate good, where her autonomy, her goodness doesn't matter as much.
That's bull. Because the Sarai afflicted her.
Yeah.
Afflicted. And that's not chill. That's not cool. Also, Abram's like passive whole thing. Like he got two wives, man.
At
Mediate,
least, yeah.
referee, settle this dispute. He's not being a very good leader if one is having to run out into the wilderness to escape the other one.
Yeah. And like other times throughout the biblical narrative, like Abraham or Abram, but both I think through the stories, he says, no, no, Sarah is not my wife. She's my sister, in order to try to like appease the system and those around him. So like Abraham isn't presented as a good husband by any standard, really. Uh, but he is quite passive in this story. Well, I think this is a good introduction because there's a lot to say about Abraham, and there's going to be so many more episodes we can do about Abraham. So this is exciting that we're finally talking about him, and he's very passive and not doing much in this story.
She's the daughter of my father, but not of my mother,
Yeah.
is what he said to that one dude with the name I don't know how to say, but I felt bad for him because that was in the middle chunk.
Yeah.
Um,
um,
Wild.
but yeah, at this point, Hagar calls the name of the deity as opposed to calling upon the name of the deity, as we see everywhere else. This is the only instance where a character names the deity, and she names it what Elroy, I think, which literally translates the God of seeing or the God who sees, which I think is fascinating. Like this is what makes my favorite story that Triple talks about. Because the first time I encountered this, I was also reading Jacques Derrida's The Spectres of Marx, and it was like both of it were for a class in graduate school. And as I was reading Spectres of Marx for one class, I had this class like right afterwards. And in the first class, we were talking about Hamlet and the visor effect. Have you read Hamlet?
I read Hamlet once.
Okay, so in scene one, there's the death of the king, the ghost of the king, where it's Hamlet's father, and he's kind of haunting the grounds, and all of Hamlet's buddies, and Hamlet sees this ghost of a king, and he has this visor on, where the ghost can see all of them, but because he's a ghost, because he has his visor down, they can't see the ghost. So there's this visor effect where there's this external figure that can see without being seen. And what Derrida kind of talks about is how that figure who sees without being seen can't be held to uh, rules. The visor, the person who sees without being seen, can attribute rules but can't be held accountable for them because he's seeing without being seen. And I think what what fascinates me is I don't think Derrida ever mentioned this story in his analysis. It's the most convoluted, confusing book of all time. I couldn't even pretend to understand any of it. But the closeness between the visor effect that we see between God and Hagar here, and between the ghost of the king and Hamlet, I think is a fascinating analysis that I think deserves much more consideration. But we're kind of presenting the scene where Hagar is this theologian, presenting God as this God of seeing, this God who sees, but this God is not held accountable. This God is this figure who is having her go back to be afflicted by Sarai, but can't be held accountable in any way. And I just that's a tangent. This is a tangent that I think is just fascinating, and I want to think more about, but I don't have any definitive conclusions on.
No, I think it's great because I want to know who to hold accountable. Who am
Yeah,
I holding accountable for these treacherous things done to my girl Hagar?
yeah,
She's outside of her country. She doesn't have her own people with her. She's in this land. She doesn't know anyone. She's being afflicted by this woman who gave her as a wife to her husband.
right.
The intention was for Hagar to become pregnant, and oh, she becomes pregnant, so now we're mad. She's pregnant, so now we're pissed. It's ridiculous.
Yeah,
And I don't like what happens next.
no. Oh, well, what happens next is, unless I'm skipping something, is that we don't get any narration about Hagar's return. The focus then shifts to Sarah and Abram, and we get this kind of language that repeats itself, going back from the sad beginning where Sarai couldn't bear a child to Abram, but then there's this happy ending where Hagar bore Ishmael to Abraham. Though Hagar's story runs kind of contrary to this, where she is undermined, her voice is silenced, and it emphasized not her motherhood, but Abram's motherhood. And then Abram is reported as the one who names the son, and that strips the power from Hagar, who was given the name in the Annunciation by the messenger of God. and it's presented as neither Sarai nor Hagar having a son, but it's Abraham who has the son, thus kind of reinforcing the patriarchy in this sense.
If Abraham has no enemies, I'm dead. Is really what this is.
Abram has plenty of enemies.
I'm off number one right now because this poor woman is just completely stripped.
Mhm.
Have we gotten to the part where the um covenant is no longer hers yet?
Yeah, we finished. This is the end of the first story, the
Okay.
first chapter 16.
Where they take the covenant away from her that she was given.
Mhm.
Okay, yeah, no,
Yeah.
that's what really gets to me. Like they're like, this is for you, and he will have many offspring, and they will be of your line. Just kidding, it's for Abraham. For a
Yeah.
man, he didn't grow the child. He didn't get afflicted by Sarah, although he may have been, and we're just not she. But yeah, it's messed up. It's
Yeah.
not cool.
Right. I think that's the analysis that they're expecting, that this is indeed messed up.
But like it makes me wonder, like, how is this taught in some
Mhm.
churches? Like, what is the other framing?
Yeah. No, and there's plenty of other ways to frame this, because like this is seen as, because we get the Ishmaelites later in the Bible. If you remember Joseph in the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, we get the fun little song where the Ishmaelites go and take Joseph away. So like the Ishmaelites are this recurring character that appear in the Bible, and they're seen as, as most other nation groups around the Israelites, they're seen as fairly negative because they, you know, nations didn't get along with each other very well back then. So they are presented as negative, and this kind of acts as an etiology of sorts for this other nation group. So we see that as negative, and we see Abram and Sarah as positive figures because this is presented as this nation of, or this history of Israel, and you want to put your forefathers in good light, and that's how you're going to think about them and present them.
I'm just saying, if I was an Ishmaelite and this was our origin story, I too would have trafficked Joseph to Egypt. I don't blame them. I don't blame them. It's like, well, you know what you did to our good old Hagar, but they may have not even known her name. Did she know her name at the end of her life? Let's discuss.
But yeah, so we finished that story, and we kind of get a few chapters of Genesis where the story kind of takes a pause. Hagar disappears. Abram and Sarai change their names to Abraham and Sarah, as we know them today.
Well,
Uh,
abusers do need to have identity changes.
oh, Ishmael kind of becomes this object of divine rejection. Uh, Sarah never receives this birth announcement per se. That directly correlates to how Hagar's would be, and God only speaks to Sarai once, and that's reprimanding her for laughing, as we talked about in our Sodom and Gomorrah episode.
Good.
But eventually Isaac is born. Sarah, I love how angry you get at all of these characters. You feel so passionately about these characters. It's so fun.
I pretend it's a reality TV show and I need to pick a side.
Yeah, but eventually Isaac is born. That builds Sarah up a little bit, but uh, we get the presence of Isaac, and then the struggle kind of intensifies between the two women. Because instead of just Abraham being the central male figure that the story revolves around, we now have three male figures that the story revolves around, and women always get neglected to the side when more men are introduced from the feminist perspective.
Just in this inhospitable world to pregnant women where they don't have modern medicine and things like that. And they manage to keep these fetuses alive in their body for 9 months. But hey, let's talk about the men.
Men. But yeah, so we get to Genesis 21, verse 9 through 21, and this is where we kind of get the new story here again. The tension is kind of reintroduced. Uh, we kind of get a highlight of Hagar here, where Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian. So Sarah, there's as we mentioned in the last section, so much is about seeing. Like so much of this section is about seeing, and how Hagar sees and who sees Hagar. But Sarah sees the fruit of the conception, and this enmity continues between the two of them. Sarah, her solution is let's cast Hagar and Ishmael out, protect their son. Uh, Abraham disapproves, but then seems to take Sarah's side, and then the deity kind of lessens Ishmael. And from this point on, really, Ishmael is kind of referred to as the boy, instead of Hagar's son or anything like that. And Hagar is kind of relegated to be slave rather than Abraham's wife. So again, a bummer.
Well, yeah, because now what's driving this? I think probably the fact that they're Egyptian. And oh, we're not going to let the mixed boy go by his name. Like,
Sure. No, that could definitely be part of it for sure. This kind of story kind of outlines like three main different forms of oppression that we see today. Oppression based on gender, class, and nationality. So Hagar has kind of become this representative for women who have been discriminated or oppressed or in any way, particularly based on class, sex, or nationality. So, yeah, for sure. Definitely. Egyptian is a big part of this and can't be overlooked.
well, it's so messed up because the writing of this, like, put it in a way where Hagar shouldn't leave because it is going to like help her son and uplift him. And then we get to this next section, and no, actually, you didn't leave to bolster these people who have kept you enslaved, to be a part of their story, to further along their narrative, to further along their plot line.
Mm-hmm.
Like, because now Sarah has a child and she doesn't like seeing the two children playing together. And for
Sure.
that reason, she wants them gone. And
Mm-hmm.
so, where, what was the point of Hagar coming back if
Right.
they were just going to get sent away?
Yeah. No. As the, the person in me that loves source criticism wants me to say, well, it's because these are two different stories that have been combined together. But if we're looking at it as this combined narrative for this whole Genesis as a whole book, as we have it now, as it's been passed down throughout the centuries, yeah, it really adds to the terror and the oppression that's put onto Hagar.
She's just a woman who wanted to leave with her child.
Sure, yeah,
That's all she was. And now she's become like it kind of like it just strips so much away from her,
yeah,
like throughout the story. It's so sad. Sorry, continue.
right. But yeah, Sarah kind of demands that Hagar gets cast out, and that emulates language of the Exodus, as we kind of alluded to at the beginning of the episode. But here, kind of God is on the side of the opposite of the Exodus, where God in the Exodus was on the side of the oppressed and those in need. Here, rather, God identifies with the oppressors, Sarah and Hagar, or Sarah and Abraham, meaning that Hagar receives banishment instead of liberation. And then at the end of the scene, we get the narrator using the name of Hagar, which kind of matches the emphasis that we saw at the beginning. Uh, so here, while being sent away in the Exodus story means liberation for the Hebrews, it means banishment for an Egyptian slave. So this could, I think, perhaps be seen as like a polemic against the Egyptians, as like, okay, the Egyptians, they really messed us up back in the Exodus narrative. How can we kind of retell the story, reframe a narrative in order to make sense of this whole situation of the Exodus, and kind of look at it in a reversal. So I think through this second narrative, we can really see a reversal of the Exodus. And I think that could be what the author was intending for sure. But yeah,
It's just messed up.
it is indeed. But we keep
Like,
but we
stuff.
keep moving. We keep moving through the messed upness. And it's so much differently messed up than it was in our Sodom and Gomorrah episode. And then our next three series on this are going to be messed up in their own unique ways. There's a lot of messed up stories in the Bible. These aren't stories that are going to be embroidered on a little pillow.
And yet, I don't know if we've noticed they're the stories I am most engaged with.
Yeah, well, no, because they're compelling. Like I think when when people who hold the Bible with any degrees of importance, and they try to reduce it just these happy stories that make them feel good, I think that gets rid of a whole lot of important things. The Bible presents all these stories that are compelling, and they're not always good, fun stories, but they note the human condition of some sort. They're existential descriptions of life and how the world works, whether or not that's a good thing. The Bible doesn't shouldn't be seen as okay, this is how things should be. It's saying this is how the world is. What do we do with it? How do we wrestle with that? And I think that's a much healthier way to engage with the Bible than to engage with it saying, oh, this is all good and daisies and happiness.
So you saying that actually jump started something in my brain. I don't know. My synapses fired. But I remember being told when I was younger to be like Sarah,
Mm,
to be the faithful, good wife, believe in God, obey my husband,
yeah.
without them really getting into the Sarah and Abraham stuff, but to be like Sarah.
Yeah.
But now being as old as I am, having the life experience I have, and after reading this story, I'm like, who just says that? Who just says be like Sarah? Because Sarah was not a perfect character, yet they presented her as such and were encouraging young women to be as such without truly getting into who this character was.
Right. No, it's real easy to reform any Bible story if you reduce it down to its bare basics, to miss out on a lot of other things and to miss out on all the other perspectives. If you only present one singular perspective and it's created often by powerful men in charge, you're going to miss out on a lot of things from other perspectives that aren't intentionally looked at. Look at it from the regular, normal white man perspective as well. We can gain things from all different perspectives. Look at it from source criticism. That's my favorite. Historical, critical. Like there's so many different ways to look at these stories, and you can gain so much from them personally from your in your own spiritual life, but also academically in understanding what these texts meant to people when it was being written and how it was interpreted throughout history. But that's where I am.
Is there anything else we need to talk about? Can we talk about the Bush thing?
Oh,
How
we've got this is gonna be a long episode. Sorry, everyone. But yeah, so Hagar is sent out in exile, in her own exile. At this point, we really kind of have a question about uh, Hagar's personhood. The story kind of focuses on Hagar for a little bit. The pronoun she is kind of used for the first time here in referring to Hagar, so that's kind of good. Banishment isn't liberation, but it perhaps is a step towards personhood. But we also kind of get this reduction of the child instead of her child or her son. Ishmael is kind of just referred to as the child, and that kind of creates an emotional distance. And we get Hagar asking not to see the death of her child. They've run out of water, and Hagar says, "No, I don't want to see the death of the child."
this is what gets me. This is what gets me because she cannot care for the child. This is like, but when she was trying to escape the first time, she really only had to care for herself and maybe
Mm-hmm.
keep her pregnancy viable as she's going through the wilderness.
Sure.
And then when she's finally sent off and banished, it's not just her, it's an actual child. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's much easier to take care of a child in the womb than it is outside of
Sure.
the it's much easier to keep the child safe. And that
Sure.
makes me mad
Yeah.
because they literally like God was fine, like, and if you believe in the whole like ever knowing, all knowing kind of thing, like was fine knowing that she would be sent out into the wilderness in
Sure.
unsafe conditions and in a situation that would not be good. So of course she's feeling hopeless. Of course she's detaching.
Yeah. I don't know if she's detaching as much as just grieving. and we get that she weeps, and a lot, some even ancient translations try to change the feminine verbs to masculine to kind of imply that it's Ishmael who's weeping, but and that kind of like robs Hagar of her grief. But no, it's Hagar who's weeping, Hagar who's grieving. Um, and even though the child is dying, their narrative still kind of focuses on Hagar and her actions and her thoughts and her words and her emotions, kind of presenting this polarity of life and death in the wilderness. Whereas the first time when she was in the wilderness, it was kind of, fruitful, like she was doing good. There was a spring, it was fine. But this time they're on the brink of death. And we kind of get this later in the Exodus story too, where Israel kind of the nation of Israel, the Hebrews, kind of have the polarities of the wilderness of life and death. And unlike Hagar, they complain, but God remains on the side of the Israelites, whereas God is not on the side of Hagar in this story. So at this point, Hagar isn't receiving much attention from God, unlike the first story that we had a few chapters ago. But when Ishmael kind of speaks, that evokes divine attention. We get divine speech here, not who's asking Hagar questions anymore, but kind of going off into a monologue. So again, we're not really concerned with Hagar anymore, but with her son, with the boy, if you will, because we kind of never describe Ishmael as relation to Hagar anymore in the words used. So no promises are made to Hagar this time. She's not promised that she's going to have a ton of children or anything like that. But uh, but Ishmael is kind of promised to have tons of descendants. So after living under the hand of Sarai, Hagar is told to kind of lift up the hand of the boy. So we have this lessening even more so of Hagar, who had to work and work and work for Sarai, and now she has to work for Ishmael. But at this point, luckily, amen, hallelujah, uh, God finally opens up the eyes of Hagar and she sees water. So just when Hagar asked for her eyes to be closed to not see the death of her child when they ran out of water, God opens her eyes and they see water, and she no longer has to see the death of her child. So that's kind of the literary happenings happening there. And this time, instead of seeing God, naming God as the God of seeing, she sees material resources for her child. And that's kind of the route that this story takes.
Yeah, yeah, bravo. Cast her out. You put her in a circumstance where she gets beaten, but oh look, water.
Yeah. But the story kind of ends after many, many years. The deity kind of gets credit with helping them live through the wilderness. Ishmael prospers. In the final scene where Hagar is mentioned in the entire Bible, she's finally called mother, but Ishmael is still just the boy, not her son. And Hagar continues to serve. She's the one that finds Ishmael's wife. In her last act, she guarantees the promise of descendants given to her a few chapters ago, and she finds an Egyptian wife. So she guarantees that they're going to be Egyptian. So I think that's intentional of them saying, okay, these are fully other people now. Written from the Israelite perspective, as this is, Hagar and Ishmael are fully other now in that sense.
And you know what? Based on what they did to Hagar, I too would cause the Exodus.
Yeah. Okay. Um, but yeah, so I think this is read contemporarily, where Hagar is kind of this spokeswoman for the oppressed woman, regardless of if it's based on nationality or class or sex. She is powerless because God supports Sarah, and she's kept in her place as this innocent victim of use and abuse and rejection. And because of all of that, she acts as this figure of not hope. I don't think she really acts as hope for the used and the abused and rejected woman, but she acts as this person to kind of stand in place and say, okay, that has happened there before. That story is my story. And for women who have been in that position to see Hagar as kind of a representative of their own story, I think can be quite powerful. And it's really sad when the story is not presented in a way and we still see Hagar as the enemy for some reason. And I think Hagar is often presented as bad by a lot of people. And I think that is that by presenting Hagar as bad is really harmful.
But this is also like not a great representation of women who are used and abused
Right.
because like she was still just a vehicle to
Yeah.
drive other people's stories. Like
And that's
I
and that's I think that's part of the abuse.
yeah, like I see why like it would be good for people to be like able to see a biblical character and relate and like to keep faith and like have hope. But also
Yeah.
like she's so severely mistreated and stays where she is mistreated and then is mistreated even more.
Yeah.
Whereas she had her first opportunity to get out and she was stopped by a deity. Like I worry about what message that could send to like maybe stay in your situation because
Mm.
things will get better eventually, something will intervene eventually.
Yeah.
Like that seems like a dangerous,
Yeah. I think she's a symbol of the oppressed, not a symbol of what the oppressed should do or how the oppressed should be treated.
but I think it could be twisted that way.
Oh yeah, and for sure. And the story has been twisted in so many bad ways.
So I was addressing that dangerous line
Right. No,
because
for sure.
I think there is a lot of opportunity for people to twist
Yeah.
this story into a narrative they think would keep, I don't know, marriages together, maybe keep
Right.
people from getting divorced. So
Yeah. And it always runs the risk, but you know, it's a story we've got, and it's a story we're here interpreting.
I know.
Because while Hagar is presented as this object that is, her humanity is never really given to her, she's also this, notable figure who's the only person in the whole Bible that names God. And the first person to bear a child within like the historical history of the mindset of Israelites. She's the first woman to hear an annunciation. She's the only woman to receive the divine promise of numerable descendants. The first person to weep for her dying child. So she is this notable figure, and I think she deserves that status of being recognized as a notable and important figure.
Yeah.
But that can also we also must note and grieve with her and hold her in memoriam for the tragedies that constantly befell her.
Yeah.
But yeah, rough story, especially and so as you might know, this isn't a fun book. This is a quite sad and upsetting book. But I think it presents these stories that have become kind of toned down for a lot of people in new lights that I think are very important to look at.
Just a quick peek into what the next few weeks holds for us because Matthew told me each story is going to get sadder. So,
Yeah.
so you're prepared. This is how each of the four individuals were labeled in the introduction, because I did read it. Hagar, the slave used, abused, and rejected. Tamar, the princess raped and discarded.
We
The
briefly talked about her in our Joseph episode, I
yes,
think, very
we did.
briefly.
The unnamed woman, the concubine raped, murdered, and dismembered, and
We
then the
briefly talked
daughter,
about her in our Judges episode, and maybe in our Sodom and Gomorrah episode, I think.
yes, and then the daughter of Jephthah, a virgin slain and sacrificed.
I don't know if we've talked about her yet, but maybe briefly during our Judges episode as well. But yeah,
Anyways, these are women being done dirty.
yeah, nope, that's our theme for the next few weeks, and that's something that we chose. So these stories are definitely uh, things. I think by reading this through a literary feminist perspective, I think the best way to engage with these texts are to grieve with them. I think that's what Phyllis Trible is inviting us to do, uh, for sure. And the rough text, especially looking at them through these lenses. But I think it's important to look at them through these lenses.
Unfortunately for you, grief makes me angry. So this is going to be a lot of angry rants from me in the next few
Cool.
weeks. But I'm excited. Thank you, Hagar, for what you went through.
Yeah,
We not loved your story, but we loved analyzing it.
we did. We did love analyzing it. Thank you all for listening. Please check us out on all the social medias: TikTok, Instagram, Bluesky, X or Twitter, Facebook. We're on
YouTube,
Facebook. What was that?
YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music.
All of them. Wherever you get social media or podcasts, we're there, probably. And send us an email, the religious treehouse at gmail.com. Tell us what you agree with or what you hate, or if we're heretics. Whatever you want. If you want to just talk to us about, the last TV show that you watched, I'd love to hear about it. Send us an email or message us, send us a DM. But yeah, thank you all for listening. We look forward to talking to you next week, and hopefully you talk to us before then. Bye.
Bye.